Hello and welcome to week 8 of business law. This week we're going to continue our journey through contracts, covering material in 3 different chapters and some miscellaneous stuff besides, covering some of these various issues that we encounter in contract law. Well, I've already apologized to you for spending a lot of time on contracts, but we will do that because it is so vitally important, again, to the conduct of business anywhere. So after looking at what the basics of a contract really is last week, this week we're going to kind of start taking a more detailed look at various aspects of contract law, getting into a little bit more detail. Hopefully you remember from last week that to form a contract you have to have 2 basic ingredients: mutual assent, so that both parties are agreeing on what they're agreeing on, plus an exchange of consideration. And consideration is really pretty important because that's what separates just a gratuitous promise that's not legally enforceable from a contract which is legally enforceable. So you have to have that exchange of consideration. We're going to look more closely at what that can involve. Now, valid consideration must have 2 components to it. The first of those components is it has to have what we call legal value. What does that mean? Well, it means that the person giving up the consideration does one of 2 things. Either confers a benefit on the other party. For example, George tells Suzanne, if you will wash my car, I promise to pay you $10. And so that promise to pay, that's giving a benefit to Suzanne. So that can be valid consideration, that promise to pay. Well, it can be a promise to give the other party a benefit, or it can be a promise for the person giving the promise to suffer a detriment. What does that mean? Well, let's say that Cliff is driving down the road, not watching where he's going, and hits Sylvia as she's riding her bike. Sylvia tells Cliff, if you pay me $500, I won't sue you for negligence. And so here what Sylvia is offering to confer to Cliff isn't a benefit on him. She's not offering to pay Cliff something, give him something he didn't have before. What she's saying is, I have the right to put the screws to you here, and I won't do it. And so in other words, Sylvia, has the right to sue Cliff and maybe earn a big payday, but she says, I will give that up. I will suffer a detriment myself. And that can be consideration. So either on the positive side, you're conferring a benefit on the other party, or on the negative side, you could be giving up something that you would otherwise have the right to do. So either one of those things can constitute legal value, which is one of our requirements of consideration. And again, we already talked about one of those 2 components of consideration, legal value. The second component is of having a bargain for exchange. And this is really what separates contracts from just mere gifts. Here, the 2 parties are exchanging things of value, that there's some sort of bargain taking place. In a contract, the parties must exchange things with legal value. For example, we saw earlier Suzanne and George, where Suzanne was going to offer to expend her time and effort washing George's car. She's not doing that out of the goodness of her heart. She's doing it because she and George struck a bargain. He promised to pay in return for a promise to wash the car. So we have a bilateral contract in the making there. And that exchange of promise to do something for a promise to pay, those are things of legal value. That's bargained for. Those are, we have things changing hands here. And, with a gift, usually that's a one-way street. Somebody says, oh, here, have this, and gives it to somebody. Usually not in return for anything tangible. So, but with a contract, we require more than that. And the consideration, you have to have legal value, but there also must be something bargained for. There must be some kind of negotiation going on. And this is, like I said, critically important because the law is not interested in getting involved in just a gift normally. We have those things like promissory estoppel and things that we looked at earlier, but what the law is really interested in is enforcing bargain for exchanges. And so you really need to look and see if you have something where value is changing hands and it's been bargained for like that. And we can see, kind of contrasting our earlier example, what would happen if we didn't really have that bargain for exchange. Let's change our facts a little here. where George and Suzanne run into each other in Walmart. Suzanne says, "Hey, George, I'm going to come over later and wash your car for you." And George says, "Oh, thanks." Well, that's not a bargain for exchange. It's basically the same thing taking place. Suzanne is coming over to wash the car, but there's no bargain for exchange. George didn't say, "And I promise to pay you for doing that." So if there is no exchange taking place, the law is not going to enforce Suzanne's promise. So if Suzanne changes her mind and doesn't come over to wash George's car, he can't go take her to court and force her to come wash his car, because that's just a promise. It's not supported by valid consideration because we don't have that bargain for exchange. So those are the two parts of consideration there. Well, sometimes consideration doesn't work out. And if there is no valid consideration, there can be no contract. So sometimes we'll have something that looks like a contract, it sounds like a contract, it smells like a contract, but if we get down and dig into it, there's really no valid consideration. And if there's no consideration, then we don't really have a contract. And this can happen in a number of different situations. One is illegal consideration. If the consideration that's exchanging hands, for some reason, if that exchange is illegal, then we're not going to have a court willing to enforce the contract. An example would be protection money. For example, you pay me $1,000, I won't burn down your business. Okay, well, here we have somebody, promising to refrain from doing something. I won't burn down your business. Well, it sounds kind of like consideration, but you're promising to not do something that's illegal. So you have a legal obligation already not to go around burning down people's businesses. So that's not going to work as consideration. If there's a breach of that quote-unquote contract, no court is going to get involved in that because there's really no consideration at all. Illegal consideration is really no consideration. Sometimes we have something called an illusory promise. The terms of the contract, in other words, don't require one of the parties to perform unless he feels like it. So if somebody's really not on the hook, to really follow through, we're not going to consider that valid consideration. For example, I promise to buy 10,000 widgets if I decide I need them. Well, remember that with a bilateral contract, a promise to perform can be valid consideration, and that's fine. But you actually have to put yourself on the line. And if I promise to buy them if I feel like it, that's not really making a promise to perform, is it? That's a promise to perform if I feel like performing. And so it's really not a promise to do anything. And so that's not going to work. You actually have to have something a little more definite than that. And so in this situation, that person who's promised to buy the widgets if they feel like it hasn't really conferred a legal benefit or a detriment. That person may decide to go ahead and buy the widgets later, but they may not, and there's really nothing to force them to. And so at the time the promise is made, that's a critical time, and if the person's not really going to be on the hook for anything, then that's an illusory promise. It's not valid consideration. Continuing with failure of consideration, sometimes people will try to use what we call a moral obligation to be consideration, and that doesn't work either. And that happens in a situation where the person making the promise, the promisor, may feel obligated to honor the promise out of some sense of moral duty, but there's no real exchange of legal benefit or detriment that would create any kind of binding contract. For example, let's look at this situation here. Little Susie comes to Bob's door raising money for one-legged orphans in Africa. Bob says, "Fine, I'll give you $100 next week." But when Susie comes back next week to collect the donation, Bob tells her to scram, that he won't pay her a dime. So Bob, we can stipulate to the fact Bob is a dirtbag. Bob is a bad person. Is Bob going to hell when he dies? Probably he is. But do we have a contract here? Well, no, because there really wasn't any kind of bargain for consideration here. Little Susie says, "Oh, please help the little orphans in Africa." And Bob says, "Okay," but Bob's really not, exchanging, there's really nothing exchanging hands here going both ways. Again, it's basically a gratuitous promise because there's no bargain for exchange of something of legal value. It's just, little Susie's not really conferring a benefit on Bob. She's just asking for money, and Bob says, "Oh, okay, I guess I'll give you some," but then he doesn't. So it's really just a gratuitous promise. There's no bargain for exchange And although Bob might have a moral obligation to follow through on his promise, the law is not going to make him do that typically in this situation. Now, having said that, remember we saw an example last week where Daddy Warbucks had agreed to pay a whole bunch of money to Crowder College to build a hockey rink, and Crowder, in fact, started building the hockey rink and then came to Daddy Warbucks and said, "We'd like our money, please." And he said, "I changed my mind. I'm not going to pay you anything." And in situations like that where someone's over a barrel and they relied to their detriment on a promise like that, then we have theories like promissory estoppel that may come into play. Here, probably not, because Bob probably just told her, "I'll give you $10 or something." I said, and the example was $100. Okay, so Bob, is promised to give $100. How far is that $100 going to go? Is the little one-legged orphans in Africa charity going to go out and build a new headquarters based upon Bob's promise? Or are they going to start, building a distribution facility in Africa for all the goods that they're going to buy with Bob's money? No, it's just not that big a sum. So it's unlikely they're going to be out on a limb far enough to where that would, bring one of these theories into play. But in a situation where someone's promised to pay $1 million and someone relies on that promise to their detriment, then we might have promissory estoppel come into play. But anyway, we're not going to have a contract because it's really just a moral obligation. It's not a bargain for exchange that would create valid consideration. Consideration can also fail in a situation where we have what's called a pre-existing duty. In order to explain that, let's just look at an example. Little old Melba lives alone with her cat. The cat climbs up her magnolia tree and gets stuck, so Melba calls the fire department. Freddie Fireman shows up to rescue the cat. He tells Melba, "I'll rescue your cat if you pay me $50. Of course, Melba agrees because she loves her cat. Freddie rescues the cat, then demands payment. Melba, who is smarter than she looks, says, "Wait a minute, isn't rescuing cats part of your job?" and refuses to pay. Freddie sues Melba for the $50 but loses, because his promise to rescue the cat was not valid consideration. Why not? Well, in fact, Melba was right. He was under a pre-existing legal duty to rescue cats and perform other fireman duties. The guy is a fireman. He's supposed to be a fireman. Firemen rescue cats. So his promise to Melba that he would rescue her cat did not give her something of value. He already owed a duty to rescue the cat, even before he promised to do so for money. So Freddie, promising to rescue the cat, that's something he's already obligated to do. When he took the fireman job, he agreed to rescue cats. And so he's not really conferring anything new on Melba. And so when Melba promises to pay $50, there's really not a bargain for exchange of things of legal value because the pre-existing duty is there. And so, Freddie didn't give anything new of value. He already owed that duty. And for consideration to be valid, the parties must confer a new legal benefit or detriment, not something that was already owed. And Freddie already owed a duty to go rescue the cat, and so he can't. That can't be valid consideration. That's something that you already owe isn't going to be valid consideration for a new contract. And so, again, for consideration to be valid, the parties must confer a new legal benefit or detriment. Consideration can also fail if it's past consideration. In other words, something you've already done in the past can't be used as consideration to make a contract in the present, because again, just like we saw in the last slide, you have to be conferring a new legal benefit or detriment, not something that you've done before. Let's look at an example here. Ernie employee is about to retire after 30 years of service, and the boss promises to pay him a bonus in consideration of his many years of faithful service. Well, then the company backs out and won't pay the bonus. Can Ernie employee sue and enforce the promise? Probably not. That's because the employee didn't give any new consideration in exchange for that promise. So Ernie, in other words, had already worked the 30 years of faithful service. That was already in the past. And so to support a binding contract, you must provide valuable consideration in the here and now. So if Ernie said, "Oh, I'll work 5 more years if you pay me a big bonus," well, that would be okay because he hadn't conferred that benefit on the company yet. But he'd already given them the 30 years of faithful service and presumably was paid for his time also. So, that's past consideration. That's already happened. And to form a new contract, we have to have a new legal benefit or new legal detriment. And Ernie being a faithful employee for the last 30 years, that's not something new. That's already happened. And so that can't be valid consideration for a new contract. So Is a company a bunch of dirtbags? Yes, they are. If they made a promise, they're not going to enforce, but is it just a promise? Yes, it is. It's not a contract in this situation. So, and again, when we don't have a contract, we can look at other theories like promissory estoppel. So if Ernie employee, relied to his detriment, they said they're going to pay him $100,000, and so he goes out and, builds a new swimming pool and buys a bass boat or something, then maybe he would have a claim under some other theory, but we don't have a binding contract. Well, let's look at a special situation here that's called accord and satisfaction. And sometimes parties will get into a dispute about how much money is owed when a business arrangement doesn't quite go like they were planning for it to go. And so what they end up doing is reaching a newer agreement that kind of replaces the old one. For example, let's say that Jack contracts with Ted's Hot Tubs to buy a hot tub on payments. The contract calls for Ted to install the hot tub and for Jack to make 10 payments of $100, which, if you're not good at math, is $1,000. Although Ted promised the water in the hot tub would get to 150 degrees, Jack discovers that the water temperature only gets to 115, and he gets into an argument with Ted about the crappy quality of his merchandise. Finally, Ted says, "Fine, just make 5 payments of $100 and we'll call it even." So Jack agrees and pays only $500 and gets to keep the hot tub. Okay. Well, in that situation, the parties already had a binding contract for the sale and installation of the hot tub. Jack had already agreed to pay more than $500, so he's going to pay $500 and another $500. But basically, here the parties decided to make a new contract. Well, was any consideration exchanged for the new contract? Well, not really. We just looked at things like past consideration, where that might apply here because really. Jack already had a pre-existing duty to pay $500. So now how is this promise to pay $500 going to work to support this brand new contract that we just created that replaced the old contract to pay $1,000? How is that going to work? Well, the law allows things like this sometimes because the law really wants to promote private out-of-court settlement of disputes. Courts and lawyers, by their nature, are kind of lazy, and they don't want to do more work than they have to. And courts are already clogged up with enough lawsuits that we don't want, more lawsuits if we can settle it out of court. And so, in a situation like this, these two guys might have ended up in court if they hadn't done this. And really, the law is willing to allow something like this to happen just so that it won't have to deal with the case itself. And so, the law will promote the private settlement of these kinds of disputes through what we call accord and satisfaction, even though we really might not have had brand new consideration. So again, this is called accord and satisfaction. And when a contract like this goes awry, we just really want to encourage the parties to figure it out themselves. And so the law is willing to enforce an agreement like this where they reach a new agreement based on some kind of changed circumstances. Well, when Jack and Ted came to a new agreement about the price of the hot tub, this was called an accord. An accord is just another word for agreement, basically. When Jack actually paid the $500 he agreed on, this is called a satisfaction, which is where we get the term accord and satisfaction. After satisfaction, the contract is considered to be fully performed. So, can Ted come back later after Jack's paid the $500 and then sue him for the next $500 because he originally agreed to pay $1,000? No. After the accord and satisfaction, the contract is performed and done with. And so basically we went in and changed the terms of the original contract and basically came up with a new contract. And so this works even though we didn't have really new consideration, and the law kind of lets us get away with this in order to promote the private settlement of these kinds of disputes. A fairly common way that accord and satisfaction comes up is what we call payment in full checks. Let's look at an example here. Trudy has a baby at Stella General Hospital. The hospital sends her a bill for $5,000 for services rendered. Trudy is poor and can't pay the bill. However, she scrapes together $2,000. She sends a letter to the hospital explaining her financial situation, asks the hospital to reduce her bill. With the letter, she sends a check for $2,000. On the memo line of the check, she writes, "Payment in full for delivery of my baby." Okay. So what she's basically done here is made an offer for an accord and satisfaction. She's saying, I know, we agreed that, I would pay you what I owe you, and you say I owe you $5,000, and you helped deliver my baby, and that's wonderful, and now I owe you some money, but I can't pay you the full amount. Will you accept $2,000 instead? So she's really asking to change the terms of the original contract. Is she offering new consideration? No, not really. She already owed the $2,000 and another $3,000 besides that. But here what we're trying to do, she's in a tight spot, and so she's trying to get them to write down part of the bill. On the check there it says payment in full. Okay, so what happens if the hospital cashes that check? Well, if the hospital cashes the check, we have an accord and satisfaction. It said payment in full on it, and they went ahead and cashed it. If they hadn't wanted to agree to that, what should they have done? Well, they should have sent the check back to her and said, no, you still owe $5,000, and we don't accept that. So if they go ahead and cash the check, then we can look at that example as a situation of accord and satisfaction. So in this situation, the hospital is accepting the $2,000 if they go ahead and cash the check as Trudy's full performance of the contract she made with the hospital. A promise to pay in exchange for a promise to provide medical services. And so by cashing that check, the hospital is really writing off the remaining balance of the debt that Trudy owes. And if they go ahead and cash that check and go ahead and accept the accord and satisfaction here, then they cannot come back and sue her for the rest of the $5,000 that she originally owed. And we're just changing the terms of that original deal. A payment in full check can work even in cases where the person who cashes the check claims not to see the payment in full written on there, but should have noticed it. And so that's very important. If someone is trying to do this, and you're accepting the check and the check's not for the full amount, you need to be sure that it doesn't say payment in full on there. And if you don't want to do it in accord and satisfaction, like I said, you need to send the check back to the person and talk about it some more, because if it says payment in full on there and you go ahead and cash it and say, well, please give me the rest of my money, that's too late, because by cashing that check, you may be agreeing to an accord and satisfaction. So in some situations, even if you didn't see the payment in full on there, you have a duty to look at the checks that you're cashing. And so if you should have noticed it and didn't, a court might decide in the other guy's favor. So that's very important if you're accepting payments, to make sure that this isn't happening if you don't want it to happen. Now, I will say there are exceptions in the law, because there are big companies that process tons of checks every day. If you're the electric company, and every day, they bring in a dump truck full of people's electric bills and a bunch of checks, and they dump them into a hopper, and some machine sorts through them. The machine's not going to notice if it says payment in full. And so this is probably not going to work on Empire District Electric if you're trying to write down your electric bill, because it's a huge company like this with automated machine processing and all that. They can wriggle out of this usually, but if you're, just doing services for somebody and, kind of have a small business or something like that, you need to watch out for this, because they could put payment in full on the check and send it to you if you cash it, and you may be writing down part of your bill without intending to, and we don't want that to happen. So something important to keep in mind. Now we're going to shift gears just a little bit and start talking about capacity. In order to have true mutual assent to a contract and to have a valid contract, both parties must have the mental capacity to understand what they're doing. So we're going to look at situations where we may not have the legal capacity to enter into a valid contract. In other words, there's something that is preventing one of the parties from having enough mental with-itness to understand exactly what they're getting into when they agree to a contract. And if they don't understand the legal obligations they're undertaking by agreeing to a contract, then we haven't had true mutual assent. And so we may undo a contract in a situation like that. So that's what we're going to look at here, situations where we don't have the appropriate mental capacity in one or more of the parties. One situation where we might have a capacity issue is with minority. And then that is one of the parties to the contract is under the age of 18. In other words, is not an adult yet. Pretty much the law tends to presume that anyone younger than 18 is too stupid to understand what's best for them. And so because of that, the law will act to protect these youngsters from getting into something that they don't truly understand. And so we'll try to protect them if they enter into a contract. The infancy doctrine is what we refer to this legal system to where we protect minors from contracts. Basically, it says in most cases that when a minor enters into a contract with an adult, that the minor can cancel the contract at any time for just about any reason or no reason at all. The adult cannot, but the minor can. So we'll let the minor get out of a contract if he or she changes his or her mind. And that's the infancy doctrine. The adult who's a party to this contract still has to perform just like any other contract, unless the minor decides to go ahead and cancel it, or the legal term is disaffirm the contract. So if the minor disaffirms the contract, that lets the adult off the hook. But basically, if an adult enters into a contract with a minor, the general rule tends to be that the adult has to perform, is legally bound to perform the contract, but the minor can change his or her mind and bail out of the contract pretty much any time. And again, the intent is to protect the minors, is to keep the mean, sneaky adults from exploiting minors, kids who are too young and too stupid to really understand what's best for them. And so the law will step in and try to protect minors in this situation. Well, again, if the minor has the option to cancel a contract at any time, that means that the minor can't get stuck in an unfair contract that he stupidly entered into because he was young and inexperienced in the ways of the world. So that's the good side of it, I guess, is that it actually protects folks who are younger than 18 from getting stuck into a bad contract that they entered into against everyone's better judgment. And it has a major side effect, though, because if that's the situation and the adults know this, then they're going to be very, very discouraged from entering into business transactions with minors. Are you going to want to sell a car to a minor if he could, bring it back and undo the contract the next day? And so when you're talking about especially major purchases and things like that, the infancy doctrine can greatly discourage adults from entering into transactions with minors. So let's look at an example here. Jake is 16 years old, so he's a minor. He buys a couch from Randy's Rent to Own. After 3 weeks, Jake returns the couch and announces, "I am disaffirming my contract." And I'm sure that's exactly how he would say it. And demands his money back. Of course, the couch doesn't smell the same as it did when he left the store. Will Randy want to sell to any more furniture to minors? Well, probably the answer is no, because if he sells the couch and then gets the couch back after 3 weeks, not only does he not make the profit he was expecting to make from this rent-to-own arrangement, but also now he has a stinky couch that he has to sell some way or other. And so this kind of situation tends to discourage adults from entering into contracts with minors. So this disincentive to do business with minors caused by the infancy doctrine can cause some real problems. Why? Well, because minors need to buy things in order to live. Just like everyone else, people below the age of 18 have to buy food and clothing and shelter and that kind of thing. So the law has an exception to the infancy doctrine when the minor enters into a contract to purchase what is called necessaries. And this is the basic necessities of life. Again, food, clothing, shelter, medical care, things like that. Because we don't want to discourage people from selling those kinds of things to minors, because we don't want minors to starve, to go without clothes, to go without shelter, or to go without medical care. And so the law will have an exception to the infancy doctrine in situations of that kind. Sometimes the party who entered into a contract with a minor will try to enforce the contract against the minor's parents. Usually that won't work very well. Unless the contract was for necessaries that weren't being provided by the parents. Parents have a duty to provide those things, and so we might enforce a contract against the parents in that situation. A parent's duty, though, to support a child ends normally when the child reaches 18 or is emancipated. Emancipation just means that even though the child hasn't reached the age of 18 yet, and we'll go ahead and consider them legally to be an adult. And so that'll happen sometimes, but they have to go to court and be declared to be emancipated. So that may be a possibility. Usually minors who are married, because usually the legal marriage age is 16 or 17 or something like that, in many states at least. So if they go ahead and get married, then they'll be considered emancipated. We'll treat them as adults if they're married. But so that's one issue dealing with capacity is minority. The general rule, again, is the infancy doctrine that minors can get out of contracts unless it's for necessaries. We don't want people to refuse to sell necessaries to minors, and so we will, the minor has to be forced to honor that contract even though they're a minor if it's for something necessary. So in a nutshell, very quickly, that's the issue of minority. Well, there are other kinds of incapacity as well. Sometimes people lack capacity due to a mental illness or a defect of some kind. They're just, for whatever reason, imagine an old person with Alzheimer's or dementia, something like that, or maybe someone who has mental retardation or some other, diagnosed, mental disease or defect or something like that. And so a person like that may not actually have the mental capacity to enter into a contract. And if they're not capable of understanding the legal obligations that they are undertaking by signing the contract, then they lack the necessary capacity for contract formation. And that's really the test. If they can't understand what they're entering into, then they just don't have the proper capacity. If a court has actually declared that a person is mentally incapacitated and made them a ward of the court or appointed a guardian for them, then that person is legally incapable of entering into a contract. And so just legally, you don't have capacity as a matter of law in that situation. So a court has already declared you don't have capacity. In a situation of that kind, if a person who is legally does not have that kind of capacity tries to enter into a contract, it's not going to work. Any contracts they try to make are going to be void from the get-go. They're not going to be voidable, they're going to be void. So the contract never happened, basically. If the person has not been judged incompetent by a court, but still lacks the mental capacity to enter into a contract, then that person's contracts are voidable. And remember the difference between void and voidable. Void, is just not good from the get-go. Voidable, though, we'll consider that to be a valid contract until the party who lacks the capacity, in this case, tries to disaffirm it. And so they can get out of it. They can void the contract if they choose to, but they don't have to. And so in a situation of that kind, that person's contracts are going to be voidable. Sometimes we have a situation where a person can be perfectly sane and rational 1 minute, and then they can be completely not sane and not rational the next. In those situations, normally any contracts they make while they are lucid, so in other words, while they are with it, those will be perfectly enforceable and binding. However, any contracts they made while they are loopy, those are going to be voidable. And so sometimes that just becomes a problem of proof. If you're trying to enforce a contract against someone who has these clear and lucid periods, and then also their kind of other periods, it's going to be a matter of proof, to whether they were in their right mind or not when they entered into the contract. And if they were, and you can prove that, then you can enforce the contract against them. But certainly you're kind of taking a risk if you enter into a contract with someone that sits in a state like this. So, but that's the general rule there. Sometimes, I don't know if you realize this or not, but sometimes people can drink so much alcohol that they can't understand what's going on around them. And so a person who is suffering from that kind of intoxication may not understand the nature of the transaction they're entering into. And if that's the case, then they may lack the capacity to enter into a contract. In those situations, most states are going to allow the intoxicated person to disaffirm the contracts that he entered into while intoxicated. So again, just like, they're not going to distinguish that from any other kind of incapacity. So if you're too drunk to understand what you're doing, they may let you out of the contract. Some states, however, kind of take a dimmer view of this kind of thing. And so they'll only allow you out of a contract of this in this situation if you weren't responsible for your own intoxication. So if somebody pours something into your drink while you're not looking and gets you intoxicated, and then as you sign a contract, they'll let you out of it then. But if you just sat around, taking shots or whatever until you were so completely out of it and then said, bring me contracts, I want to sign contracts, well, we're not going to let you out in that situation. And so some states will just kind of look at the personal responsibility aspect of it and say, well, if you're stupid enough to get that drunk, we'll stick you with the contract you were signing while you were drunk, unless somebody, did that to you. And if it's not your fault, they'll let you out of it. But so anyway, two different rules there depending on what state you're in. But I guess the general rule is don't get drunk and start signing contracts. Another issue that we'll look at is legality. Basically, the law is not going to enforce a contract to do something illegal. Well, sometimes illegal contracts are obvious. Probably the most egregious example that we can think of is a contract killing. Put a hit out on someone. If you want to hire some guy in the bar to go kill your wife or something, that's an illegal contract. The object of that contract is something that is illegal and wrong and bad. That is not in any way, shape, or form going to be an enforceable contract. So that much is obvious, but sometimes things that are less obvious also make a contract illegal. For instance, there are some old statutes that used to make it illegal to enter into contracts on Sundays. The good Lord doesn't want us doing business on Sundays, is what those legislatures thought, and so they outlawed contracts on Sundays. So by law, any contract entered into on a Sunday was going to be void. So that doesn't exist anywhere anymore that I'm aware of, but just as an example, the legislature can come in, pass a statute that makes something illegal, not quite as obvious as a contract killing, and if your contract violates the terms of that statute, it's going to be void. So anyway, there are some things out there to be on the lookout for. One of those things is usury, and many states still have statutes that outlaw usury, although that has been liberalized quite a bit across most of the country. Basically, usury is just defined as charging an interest rate that is too high. And this kind of goes actually back to the Bible if you go back far enough. But the idea is that if someone is kind of on hard times and they need to borrow money, it's just wrong to charge them an interest rate that's too high. That'd be too unfair. So that's the idea. And so the states would step in and try to limit the upper amount of an interest rate. And so if you had a contract that called for too high of an interest rate, then by law, that would violate the usury statutes, and that would be an illegal contract, and so it would not be enforceable. So in a situation that kind of, there is a usury statute that would say, for instance, the highest rate that's legal to charge in the state of Arkansas, because I know Arkansas used to do this until at least pretty recently, say they'd say it was 6%. So if your contract called for borrowing money at a rate of 7%, you ran afoul of the usury statute, so your contract would be illegal. Well, what would happen in that case? Well, it would depend on what the statute said. Some statutes would punish the evil lender in this situation by reducing the interest rate, maybe down to the maximum that the law allowed, maybe all the way to 0, just to kind of make a point. So it would vary again depending on the state, but charging too high an interest rate would get you in big trouble with your contract. Usury laws are still in effect in a lot of places, but they've lost a lot of their teeth. Again, I went to law school in Arkansas, so I know something about Arkansas law, and they still had a usury statute in place when I was in law school a few years ago anyway. So I know that it may have been replaced by now, I'm not sure, but they still are in effect in a lot of places. But they've lost a lot of their teeth, and if you notice, we have payday loan stores on every corner, so and they charge crazy high interest rates. So they've kind of gone away, but they're still an issue to be aware of. They really started going away thanks to the state of South Dakota, strangely enough. Years ago, South Dakota, some enterprising state legislators there kind of saw an opportunity for business in South Dakota. And so they eliminated their usury laws. And overnight, they became the mecca for credit card companies. And so because most states would limit the APR on a loan to something less than a credit card company would want to charge, that was kind of bad for credit card company business. Well, South Dakota eliminated their usury laws, and suddenly all these credit card companies could flock to South Dakota and set up shop there, and they were a South Dakota company, and when you signed the contract, it was a South Dakota contract, and so they could charge 18-20% or whatever they wanted to for the people who were charging money on their credit cards. And so that made credit card companies flock to South Dakota like birds migrating in the wintertime. And so they all ended up there, and I remember even when I was like college age and starting to get all these credit card offers in the mail, a lot of them were from like Citibank of South Dakota and stuff like that, just because all these credit card companies would relocate up there to avoid the usury laws. And so South Dakota was kind of the groundbreaker on that. However, once the other states saw what South Dakota was doing, they said, hey, wait a minute, we don't like that. If South Dakota's not going to do it, we don't want to, be, stuck behind. And so, in a lot of places, usury laws have either been eliminated or watered down a lot. And so, like I said, we have these evil little payday loan places on every corner that charge people who can't afford it a crazy amount of interest. So they really relax these laws a lot, but it's still a live issue that you should be aware of. If you're trying to self-finance something, that's something you should check into is, what kind of interest rate is actually legal to charge, because that could become an issue for you potentially. Well, some contracts may not be exactly illegal, but they are against public policy, and we would still not convince a court to enforce them because of that. What's public policy? Well, that's basically the set of values that the law tries to encourage in society. So if a contract aims to violate these principles of public policy, then a court may just refuse to enforce it. For example, let's say that for somehow or other, a contract was entered into that encouraged racial discrimination in some way. Maybe you had a lease, for a motel or something that wouldn't let people of color stay in it or something. I don't know. That have all kinds of other legal problems too. But if there was a contract that somehow violated this kind of public policy, when our public policy is to promote equality, that might invalidate the contract. Basically, a court just would not enforce that because it violated some important public policy. So, another example might be for something like prostitution. Even if the prostitution itself wasn't illegal per se, if there was some kind of contract that involved money for sexual services or something like that, a court might not get involved in that, even if it's not strictly speaking, criminally illegal. They're not going to enforce a contract that would violate public policy because of our moral code and sensibilities and that kind of thing. So again, you might have a situation where, because it violates public policy, a court's just not going to be willing to step in and enforce a contract. Well, contracts that are illegal are usually void from the get-go. So they're not going to be voidable, they're just going to be void typically. Since no contract ever actually existed, a court will normally leave the parties where it finds them, is the phrase that you see, especially in the older cases. Well, what does that mean? Well, for example, Randy hires Ned to kill his wife and pays him $5,000. Then Ned backs out of the deal. Randy sues Ned to recover his $5,000. Will a court tell Ned to pay the money back? And the answer is no. The court's not even going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. It's going to leave those parties where it found them. It's not going to get involved in that situation at all. And so again, an egregious example, I don't think anyone who actually hired someone to kill their wife would be stupid enough to end up in court arguing about it. But just to kind of illustrate the point, if the contract called for something illegal, the court's just not going to get involved in that. It's not going to try to make it right or, force somebody to pay money back or anything. It's just going to say, this is illegal from the get-go, and I am not even going to touch it. Y'all get out of court. So that's not going to work for these guys. With an exception to that rule, though, the court may help an innocent party out. And let's look at another example here, kind of illustrate that. Marty the mobster makes Leonard pay protection money so his business won't burn down. If Leonard sues Marty to get his money back because the contract was illegal, the court will help him out because he was an innocent party in the whole thing. And so, Marty comes around and demands cash, so Leonard's business won't burn down. And, Lenny somehow, after he pays the money, gets brave enough to go to court and sue a mobster, which is probably not the smartest thing to do in real life, of course, but let's say that he does. And so the court, even though it was an illegal contract to begin with, there's illegality involved in here. It should be a void contract. The court may help out this innocent party here who, was forced to pay this money because of, a threat. So in a situation like that, a court may step in. But ordinarily, the general rule is that a court's just not going to even touch a case like that. Well, there are certain types of contracts where we might have some kind of legality problem too, and we'll look at some of those in detail here. The first one is a contract in restraint of trade. Well, we live in a free market economy. Our legal system encourages competition, and we like lots of different suppliers and, supply and demand to set prices and, all that kind of good stuff you learn about in economics. Well, if we have contracts that attempt to interfere with that and restrain the competition, they're going to be potentially in violation of public policy. They may also violate antitrust laws and other statutes and cause all kinds of problems. But just from a strict contract law perspective, they can violate public policy. For example, let's say we have a situation involving price fixing. So let's say that all the gas stations in the show, for example, put their heads together and agree to hike their prices to a certain level, and they all sign a contract. We will be charging $4 a gallon for gas when it's currently selling for $2.20. Okay, well, that's going to violate public policy. It violates other things too that we don't need to worry about right now, like antitrust and all that kind of stuff. But just from a contract perspective, that's not going to be enforced because it violates public policy. Another type of contract we might have legality problems with is called a covenant not to compete. Well, what happens in this situation is usually some kind of employment contract, and that will contain restrictions that prevent a business's employee from leaving and going to a competitor, to a company that's in competition with the employee's former employer. So you can kind of see why this might happen. Let's say that you have, for instance, two different companies that sell copy machines. Okay. And so Bob, the copy machine salesman, works for company A, for 10 years and gets to know all their customers and earn their loyalty and their trust and all that kind of stuff, and has all kinds of access to confidential company A information. And suddenly company B comes along and offers to double his salary if he jumps over to them. So he jumps over to company B and tries to recruit all his old customers from company A and bring them all the secrets to how company A is so successful and all this kind of stuff. And so you can see why company A would not want that to happen. And so sometimes in a situation like that, they will try to write into an employee's contract that they can't go to work straight for a competitor, at least within a certain amount of time, or that the competitor can't be located too nearby, so it can't be in the same town or something like that. And sometimes those are okay. The law will allow that if it's reasonable in terms of geographic restrictions, length of time, and that kind of stuff, and it depends on the circumstances. So if it says, if the contract says you can't go work for a competitor within the same state for 6 months, okay, that's probably not going to be that bad. But if it says you can't go work for a different copy machine company in the entire United States for 50 years, that's crazy. We don't want that. So it's the same kind of sensibilities that were bothered us, with contracts and restraint of trade. Basically, we just want the free market to be able to determine, where you can get a job and how much you get paid and all that kind of stuff. So we don't want to encourage contracts that kind of distort that market. And so we'll let there be some reasonable restrictions on things like this. But again, the law might not be willing to enforce a contract that has restrictions that go too far. And again, it just really depends on the circumstances there. Another kind of contract that may have issues is one with an exculpatory clause. And those are contract provisions that relieve one of the parties of tort liability. They occur fairly frequently, and you've probably agreed to them without even knowing it if you didn't read the fine print. Sometimes just like even buying a ticket, to go to a concert or something, on the back of the ticket it may have in fine print, trying to limit their liability if you fall and break your leg or something, going up and down the stairs at the concert or something, or whatever. And there are legal limitations to what they can get away with there, but courts will enforce these up to a point. They can't protect a party from liability for its intentional conduct or gross negligence. And so, a party can't get you to sign a contract that, when we intentionally batter you, you cannot hold us liable for that. Or gross negligence, it just really goes beyond the pale. But it depends on the situation. But if we have two sophisticated parties, they might be able to agree that, I won't sue you for negligence and you won't sue me for negligence or something like that. So sometimes we'll allow those, but again, if they go too far, they may be seen as violating public policy and be unenforceable. And the reason for that is that we want to not give people a way to avoid being sued for negligence, because we don't want people to be negligent. So we want them to be on the hook if they do something reckless there. So again, there may be some ability to have these clauses in there, but we won't let them go too far. Our courts won't enforce those. Let's move now to another subject, in unconscionability, which is also a reason that a court might not enforce a contract. And some contracts are basically just so unfair, a court's just going to refuse to enforce it. And when that happens, we say that the contract is unconscionable, which is kind of a mouthful. Basically, it just means it's unfair, it's unjust, and it shocks the conscience of the court. So if the court would enforce this, it would just make the court feel so horrible and so bad, the judge just couldn't sleep at night. And so if it's that bad, the court will just refuse to enforce the contract because it is so grossly unfair. What kind of contract would fit that bill? Well, let's look at an example. Sally is an elderly lady who lives near the ocean. A hurricane comes through, devastating Sally's neighborhood. Sally has medical equipment and air conditioning that she needs to keep her alive and well, but the power is out. Tom drives in from out of state and is selling electric generators at 500% over cost and on payments with 30% interest compounding monthly. In other words, he is a scoundrel who is taking advantage of people in need. However, he is the only person in town selling generators. Sally signs a contract to buy a generator from Tom. So in this situation, does Sally really have any choice in the matter? You know, she's desperate. You know, her ventilator or whatever keeping her alive is not running. She needs electricity. She doesn't see any other choice. You know, this is a horrible contract. It's grossly unfair. She's being taken advantage of. He knows it. She knows it. But she doesn't really see any choice. And so if later on she tried to back out of that contract and Tom took her to court, is the court going to enforce this contract on this poor old lady who got screwed after a hurricane? The answer is probably not, because it's unconscionable. It would just shock the conscience of the court, and the judge would not be able to sleep at night if he played a part in doing this to this old lady. So that is unconscionability. It comes into play where we have three things going on. One is that one of the parties has very unequal bargaining power. So we don't have two sophisticated multi-million-dollar blue chip companies here. You know, we have, you know, the guy with the generator, and we have Sally who's desperate, basically. And so we have very unequal bargaining power here. And second, the party with the advantage uses this unequal bargaining power to get extremely unfair contract terms. And so they really put the screws to the vulnerable party. And the weaker party had no reasonable alternative. And so, Sally here, and the old lady needing the generator, if there was a Walmart, down the street that was selling generators at a reasonable price, and she had a way of getting there, we wouldn't let her out of this contract necessarily. Basically there has to be no reasonable alternative here. So they really have you over a barrel. There's unequal bargaining power. The party with that unequal power is using it to get an unfair advantage, and the weaker party just has nowhere else to turn. And so in a situation of that kind, we may have unconscionability, and the court's just going to refuse to enforce a contract in that situation. Now we're going to look at situations which we'll call in general genuineness of assent. And this is situations where it looks like we have a contract, but then later it turns out that we might not have actually had mutual assent after all. And so this usually happens when one or more of the parties are trying to get out of a contract. This will be raised as a defense by a party that is trying to convince a court not to enforce a contract. And so somebody is maybe trying to enforce a contract, and one of the parties says, whoa, we really, turns out we didn't have an agreement after all, and so there's really no contract that should be enforced here. So really what they're saying is that there was really no meeting of the minds in the first place. It looked like we had mutual assent, but it turns out there really wasn't mutual assent, and if there's no mutual assent, and then we can't have a contract. The doctrine of mistake is one of the major things that we'll be looking at here. A mistake occurs when one or both of the parties have an incorrect belief about the subject matter of the contract. Of course, we use the word mistake in general conversation, and the meaning's really not too much different here when we're using it in this in the context of contract law. It's just that somebody goofed. Somebody thought something was true when it wasn't true, or thought something wasn't true when it was, or whatever. But in other words, there was a mistaken belief on the part of one or both of the parties. In some situations where a mistake occurs, a court will order a rescission, which is pronounced rescission, or undoing of the contract. And when that happens, that'll put both the parties back to where they were before they entered into the contract. And so it looks like we have a contract. The parties may have even started performing on the contract, but then somebody realizes a mistake was made and they shouldn't have gotten into the contract in the first place, and so a court will undo the contract and put them back where they were before the contract started to be performed. For that to happen, though, we can't have just any mistake. The mistake must be as to a material fact. In other words, it has to be something that really matters, really goes to the heart of what the contract is about. So just because something you think is dark pink and it turns out to be fuchsia, and if you're like most males, you don't know the difference between those two colors anyway. If it's something pretty minor and it's not really going to matter in that situation, it's not a material fact. But if it's something that's really, really major, you think you're ordering a bunch of buses that run on gasoline and in fact they run on diesel, or something like that, that's a major change. It just depends on the circumstances, but it has to be material. It has to be a real huge deal in order for a mistake to have occurred that would allow the court to order rescission. Really, it must be so serious that the parties would never have agreed to the deal if the mistake had not been made. So in other words, if everyone had never really known what all the facts truly were, they would have never even thought about entering into this contract in the first place. And so it really has to be a mistake that goes, again, to the heart of the deal. It has to be so serious that the parties figure out they would never have tried to enter into this deal if they had known all the facts. In other words, if there had been no mistake, there would have been no deal either. Well, we can have different kinds of mistakes. One of these is when only one of the two parties makes the mistake. And that's called a unilateral mistake. If only one of the parties has a mistaken belief about something. Most of the time, if only one of the parties made a mistake, then they are stuck with the deal, and the court will not rescind. That's the same root word as rescission. In other words, the court will not undo the contract if only one of the parties made the mistake. Not always the case, though. There are exceptions to that general rule, and we're going to look at those exceptions now. So if we have a unilateral mistake, only one of the parties actually made the mistake, and the court may rescind the contract, even if it was unilateral, if one of the parties made a mistake and the other party knew about it or ought to have known about it. So, in other words, the other party knew that his partner in this contract deal had a mistaken belief about something and did nothing to correct it and just let him kind of go out on a limb and with this mistaken belief. Let's look at an example here. Beth enters into a contract with Susan to buy lamps. Beth intends to install the lamps in a motel that she owns in Neosho. However, Susan is fully aware that the lamps have electrical plugs that will only work in Great Britain. If you've ever been to Britain, you know not only do they use 220 volts for everything, they also have these weird, strange-looking electrical plugs that will not fit into American outlets. So there's no way that these lamps can possibly work in the United States. She knows that Beth is not aware of this and intends to use the lamps in the U.S., but enters into the contract with Beth anyway. After she takes delivery of the lamps, Beth discovers her mistake when she cannot plug her lamps into the wall. So, in a situation like this, the law usually doesn't reward stupid people too much, so probably Beth should have been more careful here. But in this situation, the other party knew about the mistake and kept going anyway, and the law doesn't have much sympathy for them. And so stupid is not good, but evil is usually worse than stupid, is how the law looks at it. So if Beth, she should have been more careful, but she made a mistake, and if the other party had not known either about, the plugs on the lamps or whatever, it'd be a different case. If Beth had been the only one to make the mistake and there was no kind of evil in the heart of Susan here, but since Susan knew what was going on and just let it happen, we will stick Susan here and rescind the contract. So this is a kind of situation where a unilateral mistake may still bring about rescission. The second situation is when there's some sort of clerical or mathematical error that occurs, and it has to be a pretty obvious one. Let's look at an example here. Jorge wants to buy 12 sets of tables and chairs for his restaurant. He negotiates with Frank, who sells furniture. Jorge writes to Frank intending to make an offer to buy the furniture he needs for $6,000. However, Jorge's secretary makes a mistake, and the letter to Frank offers to buy the furniture for $60,000. Immediately after he receives the letter, Frank tells Jorge, "I accept your offer." Okay, so it looks like we have an offer and an acceptance here, an exchange of consideration, a promise to pay for a promise to sell, all that kind of stuff going on here. But obviously there's been a mistake. And in this kind of situation, it was obviously an error because, here it's a tenfold difference, 10 times the value that they were talking about earlier. So in a situation like this, Frank has to know that there's a mistake here somewhere, that no one's going to want to pay 10 prices for this set of furniture. So a situation like that where Frank should realize no one would purposefully offer that much, we're not going to stick Jorge with this deal. In all likelihood, we'll probably let him out of the deal. So after he fires his secretary, he can call his lawyer and probably get out of this contract, even though it was a unilateral mistake. So usually the case. And again, everything depends on circumstances and stuff. But this is the kind of situation that we're envisioning here. So one more situation with a unilateral mistake where we may still allow rescission is where the mistake is so serious that enforcing the contract would be unconscionable. Remember what unconscionability is. Well, maybe our last example would work here too, because enforcing this contract on poor Jorge because he had a careless secretary and making him pay 10 times the value of this furniture, that's going to be really, really unfair to Jorge. He'll probably go bankrupt, have to close his restaurant, fire all his waitresses and all that kind of stuff. And so a court might, even for this reason, not enforce a contract like that. So if the mistake is so serious that sticking the person who made the mistake with the contract would amount to having an unconscionable situation, then we'll let them off the hook there for that as well. So, kind of to review, a court, when there is a unilateral mistake, won't usually allow rescission of the contract, but they might if one of the parties made a mistake and the other party knew about it or ought to have known about it, if there was some sort of clerical or mathematical error, or if the mistake is so serious that enforcing the contract would be unconscionable. So the general rule is we won't let people out of a contract just because of a unilateral mistake normally, but if one of these three situations applies, we might. So remember, though, that rescission when there's a unilateral mistake occurring, that's the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, if only one of the parties is mistaken and goofed up, the contract will still be enforced. And so this is a lesson to us because just because, oh no, I made a mistake, that's not going to let you out of a contract. Not usually anyway. So understand your contract before you sign on the dotted line here. Make sure that you know what you're doing, because just because you made a mistake and didn't understand something, didn't know what you were signing or whatever, if you should have, and a reasonable person, with the brain would have, you'll get stuck with it. The courts don't let people out of contracts just because they don't like the contract anymore. If you should have done some more investigation and didn't realize what you're getting yourself into, that's your fault, no one else's. And so courts take a dim view of stupid people. Like I said, if the other person's evil, maybe you'll get off the hook. But if you're stupid, you'll get stuck with this contract. So don't be stupid. Make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into before you enter into a contract. Well, that was unilateral mistake. We also have mutual mistake. Mutual mistake occurs when both of the parties make a mistake with regard to a material fact. For example, Rudy signs a contract agreeing to sell to Cheryl, quote, "my house in Joplin," unquote. Well, it turns out that Rudy has 2 houses in Joplin and was intending to sell his house on 15th Street. But Cheryl thought she was agreeing to buy the house he owns on Moffett Avenue. Rudy doesn't want to sell the house on Moffett, and Cheryl doesn't want to buy the house on 15th. So a mutual mistake has occurred. As it turns out, there was never a meeting of the minds at all. And so, of course, a meeting of the minds is a prerequisite to having a contract. And so in a situation where we have a mutual mistake, that's different than a unilateral mistake. In a mutual mistake situation, either one of the parties can ask for rescission if a mutual mistake occurs. And ordinarily, again, if both parties are wanting out of a contract, that's usually not a big deal because if they both agree to undo the contract, they can undo the contract. And so in a situation like this, if you end up in court for some reason and one of the parties asks for rescission and it's clear that both parties made a mistake when they entered into the contract, that's usually an easy call for a court. They can let you out of a situation like that. There is one exception to that, though, is that we don't allow mistakes of value to be an excuse for rescission. A mistake of fact is what has to be in play here, not a mistake of value. Well, what is a mistake of value? Well, let's look at an example. Clara goes to Brenda's garage sale, finds an ugly old lamp that Brenda is asking $5 for. Clara bargains with Brenda and gets her to take $2 for the lamp. So she gets a $2 lamp here. So on a whim, Clara takes the lamp to the Antiques Roadshow and finds out, you guessed it, it's a Tiffany lamp worth $150,000. Well, Brenda, who's enjoying PBS one evening, sees that episode and seeks to rescind the contract, arguing that both parties were mistaken as to the value of the lamp when they entered into the contract of sale. And let's stop right there. Is she right about that? I think so. I mean, Clara had no idea when she bought the $2 lamp that she was getting a $150,000 lamp. She probably wouldn't have tried to bargain her down from $5 to $2 if she had known it was worth $150,000. And clearly, Brenda didn't know that, or she wouldn't have sold it for $2. So clearly, both sides have made a mistake here, mutual mistake. So we should have rescission, shouldn't we? Well, no. Clara wins because a mistake as to value won't work. It has to be a mistake of fact to get rescission. So again, we looked at examples where there's a mistake of fact, like the lamps wouldn't work, because they wouldn't fit into American outlets or something like that. If there's some kind of a mistake of material fact, then we can give a mistake that'll let you out of the contract, but a mistake of value won't work. So just because you made a bad deal and you charged too little or too much or whatever, we're not going to let you off the hook just because of that. So Clara gets to keep her lamp, and Brenda gets to feel bad about it for the rest of her life. All right, well, moving away from mistake, let's talk about fraud. We've already looked at fraud in the context of tort law. There is a tort called fraud. And, of course, it has elements, and we remember all of those. But fraud also crops up in the world of contracts as well. So if one of the parties commits a fraud upon the other party, and that fraud induces him to enter into the contract, then the innocent party can ask for a rescission. Well, let's refresh our memory. What is fraud? Well, it has certain elements. There has to be a false representation of a material fact. And so, in other words, one of the parties is misrepresenting something that's material about whatever the subject of the contract happens to be. Second, the false representation is made with the intent to deceive the other party. So it's not, it's not blowing smoke for the sake of blowing smoke. You're trying to get the other party to buy into what you're selling here. Third, the innocent party justifiably relies on the misrepresentation. In other words, it can't be something that's just so out of whack that everyone would see right through that and realize it's a lie. The innocent party, a reasonable party and a reasonable person in their position would understand, would just kind of could buy into this, and not suspect they're being duped, basically. And that and is very important. It means we have to have all four of these things in order to have fraud, not just one or two or three. We have to have all four. And fourth, the innocent party suffers injury or damages as a result. Again, a familiar concept from negligence and tort law. If we haven't suffered damages, then who cares? So here we have to have these four things. If we have all these four things, we have to have fraud. And so we will look at some of these elements in a little more detail. First, we mentioned the fraud must be as to a material fact. It has to concern something so significant that the deal would probably not have happened at all if the fraud had not been committed. So if this person hadn't lied about it, we wouldn't have had a deal in the first place. Okay. Second of all, the fraud is done intentionally. In other words, this is not a mistake situation. One of the parties is lying and knows they are lying and is doing this on purpose. And they are evil, so they have an intent to deceive. The older cases call this a guilty mind. That's kind of old-fashioned. They also use the Latin term scienter, which is one of those lovely Latin phrases. that you'll probably never use again after this class. But it's just at the mental state, just like, basically like a crime, the mens rea, the same type of idea. So this mental state is really what distinguishes fraud from an innocent misrepresentation. There's no mistake going on here. There's someone who's trying to rip somebody off. That's what we're dealing with. So there's no honest mistake here. Somebody is trying to put the screws to the other person. Well, also, for fraud to take place, the innocent party justifiably relies on the misrepresentation. In other words, a reasonable person in that situation would be expected to believe the person committing the fraud. So we can kind of see how this works by looking at a counter example where there is no justifiable reliance. Let's say that somebody tries to sell someone else the Hoover Dam. So they are claiming that they own the Hoover Dam. Is it reasonable to believe that some guy you meet on the street owns the Hoover Dam? No, it's not. Or the Golden Gate Bridge, or put in your landmark of choice in here. So if that's so obvious that a normal, reasonable person would see right through it, that's not justifiable reliance. But or if somebody is saying oh no, the car is just fine, and you look at the car and the paint's peeling off and there's no windshield and there's 3 different colors of fluids leaking out from under it, and the tires are bald and whatever. If you can see right through it, it's not a reasonable reliance. So basically, the innocent party was duped, and a reasonable person in their situation would also probably have been duped too. So they might, in other words, they're not being too stupid about it. They're doing whatever due diligence they ought to kind of look things over, and they still get defrauded. They're still fooled. So that justifiable reliance is a requirement there. Also, the innocent party has to suffer some injury. So basically, the fraud has to cause the innocent party to lose money on the deal. If the innocent party ends up making a profit anyway, then there's nothing he can complain about. And so we don't have to worry about fraud. We're going to look at different types of fraud, starting with what we call fraud in the inception or fraud in the factum. To me, that sounds kind of like a medical condition. But what it really just means is a person is misled into signing something when he doesn't even know what he's signing. This is a kind of, when this kind of fraud occurs, a contract is absolutely void from the very beginning, and we really don't have a contract at all. Let's look at an example to see how this could happen. Carl brings a box to Russell's office and asks him to sign a delivery receipt, in quotes. Russell does that. However, Russell doesn't read the fine print on the document, which is actually a contract to join the Cake of the Month Club. Carl is a salesman for the club who works on commission, which explains his duplicity here. So Russell starts receiving cakes every month and a bill for his membership, and he has no idea why he is receiving these cakes or these bills. So in this situation, he didn't even realize he was entering into a contract. So there was fraud in the inception of the contract here from the very beginning, and when something like this happens, we're not going to force that person to stay in that situation. We'll let them out of that contract because, of course, there was no mutual assent. He didn't even know that he was entering into a contract in the first place. So that's fraud in the inception, or fraud in the factum. Well, continuing with our kinds of fraud, we have fraud in the inducement. This one happens when the party understands what he is signing, but he was convinced to sign the contract because of fraud. How does that happen? Well, again, let's look at an example. Steve convinces Mabel that she has a terrible disease and that she's going to die unless she takes an expensive herbal supplement he is selling. Mabel then signs a contract to buy the supplement from Steve. She knows that she is signing a contract to buy the herbs. Later, however, she discovers that Steve lied to her and that she does not have a disease. And so it's not like fraud in the factum. She knows what she's getting herself into. She's knows she's signing a contract to buy these herbs. They're very expensive. She knows all of that. But the reason that she entered into the contract was based upon fraud. In fact, she does not have this disease, and she doesn't need this expensive herbal supplement. So she was induced to enter into the contract through fraud. So that's another type of fraud that we might have, that we will let Mabel out of that contract and rescind it because of this. Continuing with kinds of fraud, we have fraud by concealment. This happens when one party is actively trying to hide a material fact from the other party. So they're trying to cover up something and they don't want the other person to know. For example, Glenn is wanting to buy a bulldozer and Howard has one for sale. The entire underbelly of the dozer is rusted out, but Howard strategically smears mud all over the rusty places so that it looks like the dozer is just dirty, but it's in good condition. And Glenn buys the bulldozer and then discovers that it needs several $1,000s worth of repairs. And so here Howard is actually running around smearing mud on stuff, trying to conceal the fact that the dozer is a piece of junk. And so he's trying to keep that fact from Glenn, so Glenn will think it's a great dozer and go ahead and buy it. And so there's a material fact here, which is the condition of the dozer, which is not very good. And here Howard is actively trying to conceal that fact. Well, this is different than just mere non-disclosure when you just fail to tell somebody about something. Usually that's not going to get you in trouble. So if you don't make any representations that, oh, this is a wonderful bulldozer in perfect condition, or it doesn't have any rust on it at all, unless you say something like that, you're not going to get in trouble. Usually, if you just say, oh, I have a dozer for sale, look it over, and they look it over and they don't notice that it's all rusted out, then that's not your fault, because they have a duty to make sure what they're buying is what they really want to buy. And so they have a duty to kind of check it out and discover these kinds of obvious defects. Only when you're trying to actively conceal something, normally would you get in trouble. There is an exception to that, though. Sometimes a statute will place a duty on somebody to disclose something. For instance, if you've ever put your house on the market, you'll know that state law has a list of things that you must disclose when you're selling a house. Things like termite damage and stuff like that. So there are some situations where there is a duty on a person to disclose things and to actually actively mention it. But most of the time there's not. So usually non-disclosure is not going to get you into trouble, but it can in certain situations. But certainly actively concealing the truth, the true condition of the dozer in this case, and that's going to get you in trouble because that is a form of fraud. Well, moving away from fraud, we also have something called undue influence, and that one occurs when a bad person uses a position of trust to exploit some other weak person and induce them to enter into a contract. It has a couple of elements. The first one is the relationship of confidence or trust between the bad guy and the victim, and this could take different forms. For example, you could have like a lawyer and client, or a doctor and patient, or something like that. Some kind of relationship of trust, or it could be like a family relationship, or maybe a caregiver. You could have somebody who's taking care of an elderly person, and so they have a relationship of confidence and trust there. And the second element is that the bad guy uses his influence to convince the victim to enter into a contract. And so what's really happening is that the weak person here is not entering into a contract of their own free will. We have the bad person here using this influence to kind of push them into this really against their will, is the idea here. For example, Mort is a patent attorney. One of his clients, Earl, came up with an invention that will make millions of dollars. Unfortunately, Earl is gravely ill in the hospital. Mort visits Earl in the hospital and convinces him to sign a contract, giving Mort the patent rights to Earl's new invention. So here, Mort is a bad guy. He has a relationship of confidence and trust because he's an attorney and Earl is the client. And so as clients, we trust our attorneys to take care of us. They have a legal duty to do that, to look out for our best interests. Well, here Mort is exploiting that, and Earl is in a weakened condition. He's gravely ill, and there's this trusting relationship, and so Mort exploits that, Earl's weakened state and his relationship there, and kind of pushes Earl into signing over the rights to his new invention. And so that's an example of undue influence. There's really no gun to the head kind of situation here. That would be duress, which we'll look at next. But here, somebody does have the ability to really kind of use emotional pressure, that kind of thing, to push someone into doing something that they probably ought not be doing. So that's undue influence. And if we have a contract entered into under those circumstances, the victim can get out of it. Duress, we already mentioned, happens when one party threatens another party, and that threat induces the victim, to enter into a contract. The threat can be physical, certainly. Sign this contract or I beat you up. There can be the threat of physical harm can be involved. That would be the most obvious situation, but it's not the only one. It can also crop up in other situations, certainly within business transactions. For example, Mom and Pop Pickle Company is a small operation producing kosher dills. One day, National Retail Inc., a huge chain of stores that sell groceries, approached the pickle company about selling its products in their stores. Well, soon, National Retail is buying 95% of all the pickles produced by the pickle people. The pickle company expands, hires more people, and opens more plants to meet the demand. However, National Retail comes back and tells Mom and Pop that they will stop buying pickles altogether unless Mom and Pop will enter into a new contract where they agree to accept a much lower price for the pickles than was previously agreed upon. So here, Mom and Pop have completely overextended themselves, probably bought built all these new plants and factories and pickle fields or whatever on credit just to meet this demand, and so their biggest customer here has them over a barrel. So Mom and Pop have no choice but to accept the lower price, because if they lost their biggest customer, they would be bankrupt. So here you have a situation where the 800-pound gorilla, which is the big retail company, really has this little bitty pickle company in a tight spot. And so what are they going to do in this situation? They really feel like they have no choice. So with duress, in this situation, we call it economic duress. I'm not going to break your kneecaps, but I might, force you to declare bankruptcy or something like that. So that's where, one party has the other one over a barrel, and they'll go broke unless they agree to the new contract in this example. And that happens sometimes. If the victimized party can show that they had no alternative but to agree to the new terms of the contract, they may be able to show duress. And if they can do that, then they can get the court to rescind the contract and let them out. So that can happen sometimes. We'll see duress crop up in various different situations. Sometimes, like I said, there's some kind of violence involved or something like that, but it doesn't have to be that way at all. It can be economic duress, where one party really has a massive advantage over another one and is really strong-arming them in a pretty not nice way. So, all right, well, that does it for this week in contracts. We're not done with contracts yet. We'll have more to do. Hopefully you're not too sick of it yet, but there is an end in sight eventually. But we have some more to do. Again, contracts is a hugely important thing you'll be dealing with no matter what area of business you get into. So we'll spend a little more time on it. But for now, hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you later.